Welcome back, sports fans. In this segment, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the Wolverines' history with the Spartans. As some of you may imagine or otherwise know, it's quite an extensive one. Tomorrow's game will be the 113th meeting between the two teams, which the Wolverines lead the overall series 71-36-5. Under Jim Harbaugh, the Wolverines are 3-2. However, both losses have occurred in Ann Arbor, where tomorrow's game will be played. In fact, it was only last year that the Wolverines under Jim Harbaugh beat the Spartans for the first time in Ann Arbor. And just to remind you a little bit about that game, the Wolverines pretty much dominated the entire game. Shea Patterson threw for over 300 yards, I believe it was, in that game, and the Wolverines were very dominant in a 44-10 win, a game which was described by the media as the Spartans having lost their composure during the game, which is highly unusual, especially for a Mark D'Antonio team. And that's what led to essentially the rout being the way it was. I've been watching college football for some time, off and on. More so off now. It's not what it used to be for sure. But I made a list of the top 10 games between the Wolverines and Spartans to my recollection. And I took that list and narrowed it to 5. The first game on the fifth game on that list would be the 2007 game. And for those of you who may not remember, that is the game where the Wolverines won in overtime in East Lansing. And Michael Hart, who was playing his last year for the Wolverines at that time, referred to the Spartans as the Wolverines' quote-unquote little brother. And from that time onward, the Spartans proceeded to win 7 of the next 8 games. And it's for that reason that this game makes my list at number 5, because it completely turned the whole series around, which the Wolverines had been dominating prior to that time. Number 4 on the list is the 1997 game. This game was also played in East Lansing. And for those of you who recall, this was the Wolverines' national championship year. The Spartans had 6 turnovers in the game. The Wolverines were able to essentially hold the ball, and while the Spartans played a good game defensively, the Wolverines were able to simply wear them down and end up winning the game 23-7. Also, out of all the years that I have watched or been associated with Wolverines football, that was the best defensive Wolverines team I've ever seen. The Spartans' only touchdown came off a fake field goal. So credit to Nick Saban, who was the Spartans head coach at that time, for that. Number 3 on my list is the 2003 game. And yes, this game was also played in East Lansing. What was really interesting about this game is this was a very dominating performance by the Wolverines, and yet they only won the game 27-20, primarily because of 2 plays. One was a John Navarre bootleg where he was sacked and fumbled, I believe it was, and the Spartans were able to return it 78 yards or thereabouts for a touchdown after the Wolverines had driven down well into Spartan territory. And then there was a punt or a kickoff return, I don't remember which it was, that was returned by the Spartans as well for a touchdown. And those were their only 2 touchdowns of the game. Other than that, the Wolverines' Chris Perry had a Big Ten record at that time, and I believe one that still stands, 47 carries, and I believe he rushed for 237 yards in that game, something like that. But the other thing that was noteworthy is his longest run from scrimmage was 8 yards, I think it was. So credit to the Wolverines for that one. Number 2 on my list is the 1985 game, and yes, this too was played in East Lansing. So the very first game I ever saw the Wolverines play the Spartans in East Lansing. Now, for those of you who don't remember, the 1985 Wolverines team was actually quarterbacked by current Wolverines head coach Jim Harbaugh. Wolverines, though they didn't have what I think a lot of people would say is a great offense, to be sure, I think there have been a lot of Wolverines teams with a better offense, but it was kind of interesting how they scored points. And just so happened in this game, they were able to put 32 points on the board. Their defense was absolutely dominating, and they ended up shutting out the Spartans. The only time I've ever seen the Wolverines shut the Spartans out in East Lansing. However, when I was doing research for this show, I found out that it was actually the second consecutive year in East Lansing that they had shut the Spartans out. And if you look at the history of the Wolverines in East Lansing under Bull Schembechler, they're pretty dominant. And number one on my list is the 1984 game. And even though the Wolverines did not win this, and this game was actually in Ann Arbor, it's memorable because it was the very first time I'd ever seen a Wolverines Spartans game. Or at least the highlights of it. Next year would be the time I actually sat and watched the entire game. But what I do remember from that game is I believe it was a punt return, if I remember correctly, for a touchdown by the Spartans that ended up being the big difference in that game. And for those of you who may not remember, that was the year that the Wolverines beat the Hurricanes in Ann Arbor 30-14 when the Hurricanes were ranked number 1. Unfortunately, Jim Harbaugh had a season-ending injury in that game, I believe it was, and Wolverines ended up finishing 6-6, losing the Holiday Bowl to then national champion BYU, and Robbie Bosco and his comeback on a broken leg, where he threw 2 touchdown passes in the fourth quarter. It was Bull Schembechler's worst coaching season in his history, record-wise, although be it the Wolverines finished with a 6-6 record, which, being a Lions fan who didn't know anything about college football at the time, I thought was actually pretty good. In the next segment, to wrap up this show, I'm going to discuss a little bit about coronavirus in the Big Ten, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Trevor Lawrence of Clemson having tested positive for that as well. Stay tuned to College Recap on Ed's Sports Channel.